On a fog-shrouded October morning in 1953, seminarian Michael Hartwell vanished from his locked dormitory room at St. Ignatius Seminary in the remote mountains of northern Vermont, leaving behind only a blood-stained rosary and a desperate note scrawled in Latin that read, "They are not teaching us to serve God. The faculty serves another master entirely." For over 70 years, the Catholic Church has kept the true circumstances of his disappearance buried in Vatican archives. But recently discovered letters reveal a conspiracy so disturbing that it threatened to shake the very foundations of American Catholicism. What happened to the young man who had dreamed of ministering to the poor was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed was deliberately suppressed. Witnesses were transferred to distant parishes or mysteriously died, and evidence was systematically destroyed by some of the Church's most powerful bishops. Before we continue with the story of Michael Hartwell and the dark secrets that consumed St. Ignatius Seminary, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across America. The stories we uncover often hit closer to home than you might expect. The truth about that misty October evening would expose a web of corruption, forbidden knowledge, and spiritual perversion that reached into the highest levels of the Catholic hierarchy, involving seminary professors, diocesan bishops, and Vatican officials whose names were spoken in reverent whispers throughout Catholic America. St. Ignatius Seminary stood like a medieval fortress in the Green Mountains of Vermont, its Gothic towers piercing the perpetual mist that shrouded the valley like a burial shroud. Built in 1847 with funds donated by Irish immigrants who had scraped together their life savings to create a place where American boys could train for the priesthood, the seminary had produced some of the most influential clergymen in the country. Cardinals, bishops, and renowned theologians had walked its stone corridors and knelt in its ancient chapel, their prayers rising with the incense toward heaven. The seminary's isolation was deliberate. Nestled in a valley accessible only by a single winding mountain road, it provided the perfect environment for spiritual contemplation and academic rigor. The nearest town, Millbrook, lay 15 miles down treacherous mountain passes, a journey that took nearly an hour in good weather and was impassable during Vermont's brutal winters. This isolation meant that seminarians could focus entirely on their studies and spiritual development, free from the distractions and temptations of the modern world. The building itself was a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture. Massive stone walls rose 4 stories high, punctuated by narrow windows that cast long shadows across the interior corridors even during the brightest days. The chapel occupied the building's heart, its vaulted ceiling soaring 60 feet above marble floors worn smooth by decades of genuflection. Stained glass windows depicting the lives of saints bathed the interior in jeweled light that seemed to dance with otherworldly beauty during morning prayers. The seminary's library contained over 100,000 volumes, including some of the rarest theological texts in North America. Ancient manuscripts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew filled climate-controlled vaults beneath the main floor, available only to advanced students and faculty members who had proven their scholarly dedication. The collection included works that even Vatican scholars consulted, drawing visiting experts from universities across Europe and America. In 1953, St. Ignatius housed 47 seminarians ranging from first-year philosophy students to fourth-year theologians preparing for ordination. These young men came from every corner of America, united by their calling to serve God and their commitment to the intellectual and spiritual discipline required for priesthood. They followed a rigorous schedule that began with lauds at 5:30 a.m. and concluded with compline at 9 p.m., their days structured around prayer, study, manual labor, and meditation. The faculty consisted of 12 priests, each a specialist in his field and carefully selected for both academic excellence and spiritual maturity. Father Superior Augustine Blackwood had led the seminary for 15 years, his reputation for theological scholarship matched only by his fierce dedication to producing priests worthy of their sacred calling. Under his leadership, St. Ignatius had gained recognition as one of the most academically rigorous seminaries in North America. Father Thomas Meridian taught systematic theology with a brilliance that left his students both enlightened and intimidated. His lectures on the nature of divine grace and the mechanics of salvation drew visitors from other seminaries, and his published works were standard texts in Catholic universities throughout the country. Students considered themselves privileged to study under a man whose theological insights were regularly consulted by bishops and Vatican officials. Father Sebastian Carver, the professor of church history, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of ecclesiastical development from the apostolic age through the modern era. His ability to connect historical patterns with contemporary theological questions made his classes essential preparation for any seminarian hoping to navigate the complex realities of 20th-century pastoral work. Father Nicholas Wolfram taught philosophy with a precision that revealed the logical foundations underlying Catholic doctrine. His courses in metaphysics and epistemology were legendary for their intellectual rigor, preparing seminarians to defend their faith against the sophisticated attacks of modern secularism. But it was Father Heinrich Voss, the newest addition to the faculty, who would prove to be the most significant figure in the events that unfolded during the fall of 1953. Voss had arrived just 6 months earlier, carrying impeccable credentials from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome and bearing letters of recommendation from some of the Vatican's most influential theologians. His specialty was described as advanced sacramental theology, a field so specialized that few American seminaries offered instruction in its deeper mysteries. At 42, Father Voss possessed an otherworldly quality that made him simultaneously magnetic and unsettling. Tall and gaunt, with prematurely white hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see through the physical world into realms beyond human understanding, he spoke with a soft German accent that lent authority to even his most casual observations. His knowledge of ancient languages was extraordinary, including dialects of Aramaic and Hebrew that even Hebrew University scholars found obscure. Michael Hartwell had arrived at St. Ignatius in September 1950, an earnest young man from Boston whose calling to the priesthood had manifested during his senior year at Boston College. The son of Irish immigrants who had built a small but successful construction business, Michael possessed the combination of intellectual curiosity and spiritual sensitivity that marked him as exceptional seminary material. His undergraduate professors had described him as one of the most promising candidates for priestly formation they had ever encountered. At 25, Michael was older than most first-year seminarians, having spent 2 years after college working in his father's business while discerning his vocation. This maturity served him well in adapting to seminary life, and he quickly established himself as both a serious student and a natural leader among his peers. His academic performance was consistently excellent, and his spiritual development impressed even the most demanding faculty members. Michael's letters home to his parents revealed a young man deeply committed to his calling but increasingly troubled by aspects of his theological education that he struggled to understand. His father, Patrick Hartwell, had preserved these letters for decades, and they provide a window into the progressive corruption of an innocent soul drawn into circumstances beyond his comprehension. In a letter dated November 15, 1952, Michael wrote, "The studies grow more complex as we advance, dear Father. Professor Voss has selected several of us for advanced instruction in what he calls the deeper mysteries of sacramental theology. I confess that some of the texts we're studying seem to contain ideas that trouble my conscience, but Professor Voss assures us that understanding these concepts is essential for any priest who hopes to minister effectively in our modern age. Pray for me that I might have the wisdom to discern truth from error in these difficult matters." By spring 1953, Michael's letters had taken on a more disturbing tone that revealed growing anxiety about his theological studies. "The advanced seminars have introduced concepts that seem to contradict everything I learned during my first years here," he wrote in March. Professor Voss speaks of spiritual techniques that promise direct communion with divine power, but the practices he describes feel dangerous to my soul. When I expressed my concerns to other faculty members, they assured me that Professor Voss's instruction represents the cutting edge of Catholic theology, approved by the highest authorities in Rome. Yet something within me rebels against these teachings. The summer of 1953 had been particularly intense for the advanced seminarians. Instead of returning home for the traditional summer break, 12 students, including Michael, had remained at St. Ignatius for what was described as an intensive seminar in mystical theology and advanced pastoral techniques. The program was conducted entirely by Father Voss, with minimal oversight from other faculty members who were either away on sabbatical or engaged in their own summer research projects. During these summer sessions, isolated from their families and fellow seminarians, the 12 participants were introduced to practices and concepts that would have shocked even liberal Catholic theologians. Father Voss claimed to be sharing knowledge that had been carefully guarded by the Church for centuries, available only to those deemed worthy of such profound spiritual instruction. The seminarians were required to sign agreements pledging absolute secrecy about their summer studies, with Voss explaining that premature revelation of these teachings to unprepared minds could cause spiritual damage or scandal. The students were told that they had been selected for this honor based on their exceptional spiritual maturity and intellectual capabilities, and that their future effectiveness as priests depended on mastering these advanced techniques. Brother Timothy Morrison, who served as the seminary's groundskeeper and had worked at St. Ignatius for over 20 years, noticed disturbing changes in the summer seminar participants. In a letter to his sister in Burlington, he wrote, "The young men studying with the new professor have become strange, Sister Mary Catherine. They move like sleepwalkers during the day and gather in the chapel at odd hours when they think no one is watching. Their prayers sound different, not like the Latin we've always used, but in languages that make my skin crawl just to hear them. I've asked Father Superior about it, but he tells me that advanced theological study naturally changes young men, preparing them for the profound responsibilities of priesthood. Still, I cannot shake the feeling that something unholy has entered our blessed seminary." The fall semester of 1953 began with Father Voss announcing the formation of an even more exclusive group within the advanced seminar students. He selected only 5 seminarians for what he called final preparation for ordination into the fullness of priestly power. Michael Hartwell was among the chosen 5, along with seminarians Robert Chen from San Francisco, David Kowalski from Chicago, James Murphy from Philadelphia, and Thomas Anderson from Minneapolis. These 5 young men were given access to the seminary's most restricted archives, including manuscripts that even visiting scholars were not permitted to examine. They studied in a specially prepared room in the library's basement, a chamber that had been sealed for decades until Father Voss requested permission to use it for his advanced instruction. The room's stone walls were covered with symbols that Voss claimed were ancient Christian mystical signs, though several seminarians privately noted that the markings bore no resemblance to traditional Catholic iconography. Father Voss's instruction during this final phase focused on what he described as sacramental transcendence, the ability of properly prepared priests to channel divine power directly through their own spiritual essence rather than merely serving as conduits for grace administered through traditional sacramental forms. He taught that certain ancient Christian communities had possessed this knowledge but that it had been suppressed by institutional authorities who feared its revolutionary implications for church structure and papal authority. The techniques Voss taught involved meditation practices, dietary restrictions, and ritual observances that grew increasingly elaborate and disturbing as the semester progressed. Students were required to fast for extended periods, consuming only specially prepared substances that Voss claimed would purify their spiritual essence and prepare them for direct divine communion. They participated in midnight ceremonies in the sealed basement room, rituals that combined elements of traditional Catholic liturgy with practices that seemed drawn from much older and darker sources. Michael's final letters home revealed a young man trapped between his desire to serve God faithfully and his growing recognition that something fundamentally wrong was occurring at St. Ignatius. In a letter dated October 10, 1953, he wrote, "Dear Father, I fear I have been deceived about the nature of my calling. The instruction I am receiving no longer feels like preparation for Catholic priesthood but rather induction into something that opposes everything Christ taught. Yet Professor Voss assures us that we are being prepared for a form of ministry that will revolutionize the Church and bring about a new age of spiritual power on earth. I am torn between my desire to serve God and my growing conviction that we are being led away from, rather than toward, divine truth. Pray for me, dear Father, that God might grant me the courage to choose righteousness whatever the cost." October 20, 1953, dawned gray and cold, with early winter fog rolling down from the mountain peaks to settle over St. Ignatius Seminary like a premature shroud. The temperature had dropped below freezing during the night, and ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the Gothic windows, creating an otherworldly beauty that seemed to mock the darkness gathering within the ancient walls. Michael had spent a restless night, tormented by dreams that felt more like visions of the spiritual corruption he was being asked to embrace. He had awakened before dawn, his sheets soaked with perspiration despite the cold, and had knelt beside his narrow dormitory bed for nearly an hour, praying desperately for guidance and strength to resist whatever final ceremony Professor Voss had planned for that evening. Throughout the day, Michael attended his regular classes, but his fellow seminarians noticed his distraction and growing agitation. During morning prayer, he had remained kneeling long after the others had risen, his lips moving in what appeared to be urgent supplication. At meals, he barely touched his food, and during study periods, he was observed staring out windows with an expression of profound anguish. Brother Morrison, making his usual rounds of the building, encountered Michael in the library during the afternoon and was shocked by the young man's appearance. His usually healthy complexion had become pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting weeks of inadequate sleep. Most disturbing were his eyes themselves, which had acquired a haunted quality that Brother Morrison had seen only in men who had witnessed unspeakable horrors during the war. "Are you well, my son?" Brother Morrison asked, his voice filled with genuine concern for a young man he had watched develop from an eager first-year student into a promising candidate for ordination. Michael looked up from the theology text he had been staring at without reading, his eyes focusing with difficulty on the kindly brother's face. "I fear I am far from well, Brother Morrison. I fear that none of us are well, and that our sickness may be beyond any earthly cure." His voice carried a tremor that made the older man's blood chill, and his words seemed carefully chosen to convey warning without violating whatever vows of secrecy bound his tongue. As evening approached, the 5 members of Professor Voss's inner circle received summons to gather in the basement chamber at 11:30 p.m. for what was described as their final preparation for ordination into the mysteries. The message, delivered by a first-year seminarian who seemed nervous about his errand, specified that they should come fasting and prepared for a ceremony that would fundamentally transform their relationship with the divine. At 10:45 p.m., Michael made a decision that would save his soul but cost him everything else. Instead of proceeding to the basement chamber as instructed, he went to his dormitory room and carefully composed a letter that he hoped would serve as both confession and warning. Using his fountain pen and his finest penmanship, he wrote, "To whoever may find this letter, I, Michael Patrick Hartwell, seminarian of the 4th year at St. Ignatius Seminary, do hereby testify that the instruction being conducted by Professor Heinrich Voss is not Catholic theology but rather induction into practices that oppose the gospel of Jesus Christ. Under the guise of advanced sacramental preparation, he has been teaching 5 of us techniques and rituals that promise spiritual power through communion with forces that are decidedly not divine. Tonight, we are to undergo a final ceremony that Professor Voss claims will grant us abilities beyond those of ordinary priests, but I now understand will actually bind our souls to whatever dark master he truly serves. I cannot participate in this blasphemy, though my refusal may cost me my life. If anything happens to me, know that Professor Voss is not what he appears to be, and that the Church must be warned about the corruption he has brought to this holy place. May God forgive my weakness in allowing myself to be deceived for so long, and may he protect those who come after from the spiritual poison that has infected St. Ignatius Seminary. Signed in the name of Jesus Christ, Michael Patrick Hartwell, October 20, 1953. Michael sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it beneath his mattress, hoping it would be discovered if he failed to return from whatever confrontation awaited him. He then removed his rosary from his desk drawer, clutching the blessed beads as he prepared to face Professor Voss and refuse participation in whatever ceremony had been planned. At 11:25 p.m., instead of proceeding to the basement chamber, Michael made his way to Father Superior Blackwood's private quarters. The corridors were empty and dark, lit only by dim electric bulbs that cast long shadows across the stone floors. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the Gothic spaces, and the sound seemed to carry an ominous weight that made him quicken his pace. He knocked softly on Father Superior's door, then more urgently when there was no immediate response. After several minutes, Father Blackwood appeared in his nightgown, his face showing irritation at being awakened that quickly changed to concern when he saw Michael's distressed state. "My son, what brings you to my door at this ungodly hour? Are you ill? Do you require medical attention?" Michael's words came in a rush, his carefully maintained composure finally breaking under the weight of months of accumulated horror. "Father Superior, I must speak with you about Professor Voss and the instruction he has been providing to myself and 4 other seminarians. What he is teaching is not Catholic theology but something far darker. Tonight, he plans to conduct a ceremony that I believe will complete our spiritual corruption. I cannot participate, and I fear for the souls of my fellow seminarians who may not have the strength to resist." Father Blackwood's expression grew troubled as he listened to Michael's account, but his response revealed that the corruption at St. Ignatius extended far beyond Professor Voss alone. Instead of expressing alarm or promising immediate investigation, he placed a fatherly hand on Michael's shoulder and spoke in the gentle but firm tone used to redirect troubled young men whose scruples had overcome their judgment. "My dear Michael, I understand that Professor Voss's instruction can seem challenging to those unprepared for advanced theological concepts. But I want to assure you that his work here has the full approval of the highest church authorities. The techniques he teaches represent the cutting edge of Catholic mystical theology, developed by scholars at the Vatican who understand spiritual realities far beyond what we encounter in standard seminary education. Your feelings of unease are natural and even praiseworthy, showing that you take seriously the sacred nature of what you are learning. But you must trust in the wisdom of your superiors and the guidance of the Holy Spirit working through established church authority." Michael's heart sank as he realized that Father Superior was either deceived about Professor Voss's true nature or, more horrifying still, was complicit in whatever corruption had infected the seminary. His voice barely above a whisper, he made one final appeal. "Father Superior, I beg you to examine the texts we have been studying and to observe the ceremonies Professor Voss conducts. What he is teaching contradicts fundamental Catholic doctrine and promotes practices that no Christian should embrace. If you will not investigate, then I must refuse to participate further and request immediate transfer to another seminary." Father Blackwood's paternal demeanor hardened into something far less benevolent as he realized that Michael would not be easily redirected or controlled. "I'm afraid that's not possible, my son. Your advanced instruction represents a significant investment by the Church, and there are obligations that bind you to complete what has been begun. Professor Voss has explained to me that the final stages of this program require the participation of all 5 selected seminarians. Your withdrawal would not only forfeit your own spiritual advancement but would also damage the development of your fellow students. I must insist that you fulfill your obligations and trust in the wisdom of your superiors." The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had corrupted St. Ignatius Seminary. Father Superior admitted that Professor Voss's program had been specifically requested by cardinal authorities in Rome, though he claimed not to know the details of these high-level communications. He explained that the 5 seminarians had been selected not just for their academic abilities but for specific spiritual characteristics that made them suitable for advanced formation in mystical theology. As Michael pressed for more information, Father Blackwood revealed that similar programs were being conducted at seminaries throughout the United States, all under the direction of specially trained instructors who reported directly to Vatican offices that operated independently of normal diocesan authority. The young men selected for these programs were being prepared for a form of ministry that would be crucial to the Church's mission in the modern world, though the exact nature of this mission remained classified at the highest levels of Church hierarchy. "The Church faces unprecedented challenges in the 20th century, Father Blackwood explained, his voice taking on the tone of a man sharing sacred secrets. Secularism, communism, and materialism threaten to destroy Christian civilization. The traditional methods of evangelization and pastoral care are proving inadequate against these sophisticated attacks on faith. The Holy Father himself has authorized the development of new approaches to spiritual warfare, techniques that will enable specially prepared priests to combat evil with power that matches the intensity of modern threats to the Church." Michael's theological training enabled him to recognize the fundamental errors in Father Superior's reasoning, but his spiritual sensitivity allowed him to perceive something even more disturbing. The older priest's words carried an underlying resonance that seemed to originate from sources other than Catholic tradition. His references to spiritual warfare and combating evil with power echoed concepts found in occult literature rather than Orthodox Christian theology. As midnight approached, Father Blackwood informed Michael that his presence was required in the basement chamber regardless of his personal reservations. "Professor Voss has explained to me that the ceremony scheduled for tonight represents the culmination of 2 years of careful preparation. The spiritual energies that have been invoked cannot be safely dispersed without the participation of all 5 designated seminarians. Your refusal to participate would not only forfeit your own advancement but could result in spiritual harm to your fellow students and even to the seminary community as a whole." Michael's request to contact his parents or his home diocese was denied, with Father Superior explaining that communication about the advanced program was strictly controlled to prevent misunderstanding by those not prepared to comprehend its sacred nature. He was essentially a prisoner, bound by vows of obedience to superiors who had revealed themselves to be either deceived or corrupted. At 11:55 p.m., Father Blackwood personally escorted Michael to the basement chamber, his hand firmly gripping the young seminarian's arm to prevent any possibility of escape. As they descended the stone steps that led beneath the library, the temperature seemed to drop with each level, and the air grew thick with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. The basement chamber had been transformed since Michael's last visit into something that bore no resemblance to any Christian sacred space. The stone walls were now covered with symbols carved directly into the rock, markings that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. The familiar crucifix had been replaced by an altar constructed from black stone, its surface stained with substances that Michael preferred not to identify. Professor Voss stood before the altar, dressed in robes that combined elements of traditional Catholic vestments with decorations that originated from much older and darker traditions. His pale blue eyes seemed to glow with an inner light as he surveyed the 5 seminarians who had been assembled for the final ceremony. The other 4 young men stood in positions around the chamber, their faces showing the glazed expression of those whose wills had been systematically broken down and rebuilt according to another's design. "Welcome, Brother Michael," Professor Voss said, his soft German accent lending in sinister quality to words that should have conveyed Christian fellowship. "Tonight, you and your fellow seminarians will undergo the final preparation for your true ordination. You will be transformed from mere students of theology into wielders of spiritual power, capable of commanding forces that ordinary priests can only petition through prayer." The ceremony that followed combined elements of Catholic ritual with practices drawn from traditions that predated Christianity by centuries. Professor Voss directed the seminarians to positions around the black altar, each standing at a point marked by symbols that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. He then began reciting what sounded like a perverted version of the ordination ritual, but with invocations addressed to entities whose names made the stone chamber seem to tremble with supernatural dread. As the ceremony progressed, Michael realized with growing horror that he and his fellow seminarians were not being ordained as Catholic priests but rather as ministers of whatever dark power Professor Voss truly served. The advanced sacramental theology they had been studying was actually instruction in techniques for channeling spiritual forces that opposed everything Christian faith represented. Just before we reveal what happened to Michael during that terrifying ceremony, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest mysteries. Leave a comment below telling us about any strange experiences you've had in religious buildings. Sometimes the most sacred places hide the most unholy secrets. The climax of the ceremony came when Professor Voss produced a chalice carved from what appeared to be black obsidian and filled it with a substance that definitely was not wine. Each seminarian was required to drink from the cup while swearing an oath of eternal service to the true master of spiritual power. The other 4 young men complied without hesitation, their wills having been systematically broken down over months of psychological manipulation and gradual spiritual corruption. When the chalice was offered to Michael, he made the decision that would save his soul but doom his mortal life. Drawing upon reserves of courage he had not known he possessed, he struck the cup from Professor Voss's hands, sending it crashing against the stone wall where it shattered into fragments that seemed to scream as they hit the floor. "I will not drink from this cup of damnation," Michael declared, his voice ringing through the chamber with the authority of one who had chosen righteousness regardless of consequences. "I serve Jesus Christ, not whatever master you represent. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I renounce these dark practices and call upon God Almighty to protect me from the evil you would work upon my soul." Professor Voss's reaction revealed the true nature that he had concealed beneath his academic credentials and priestly demeanor. His pale features contorted with rage that seemed supernatural in its intensity, and his voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "You foolish boy. Do you imagine that your pitiful faith can protect you from powers that ruled this earth before your Christ was even conceived? You have participated in our preparations, consumed our offerings, and sworn preliminary oaths that bind your soul regardless of your final decision. You cannot escape what you have already become." The confrontation that followed tested Michael's faith in ways that no seminary training could have prepared him for. Professor Voss revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than a heretical priest or a cult practitioner. The supernatural displays of power he commanded, the way shadows seemed to bend to his will, and the inhuman knowledge he demonstrated made it clear that Michael was facing an enemy that transcended mere human evil. The other 4 seminarians, their wills completely subservient to their master, moved to restrain Michael while Professor Voss prepared to complete the ceremony by force. But the young man's declaration of faith had somehow altered the spiritual atmosphere of the chamber, and the demonic forces that had previously operated unopposed found their power constrained by the presence of divine protection. Drawing upon everything he had learned during his years of theological study, Michael began reciting prayers of exorcism and spiritual protection. Though he was not yet ordained as a priest, his sincere faith and desperate need gave power to words that might have been mere formalities in other circumstances. The Latin phrases he remembered from his liturgical studies seemed to create a barrier around him that the corrupted seminarians could not cross. Professor Voss, realizing that his carefully orchestrated ceremony was collapsing, made a final desperate attempt to complete the ritual by offering Michael a choice that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had corrupted St. Ignatius Seminary. He could submit willingly to the final stage of his transformation and be granted power beyond imagination, or he could die in the chamber and be buried beneath the seminary where his disappearance would be explained as a tragic accident or sudden departure. Your church hierarchy has already been informed of your unstable mental condition and your growing obsession with imaginary conspiracies, Voss sneered, his academic mask finally discarded to reveal something that was barely human. Your death will be ruled a suicide brought on by the spiritual strain of advanced theological study. Your parents will mourn a son who could not bear the weight of his calling. Your fellow seminarians will learn from your example that resistance to proper authority leads only to destruction. But Michael had found a source of strength that transcended his fear of death or concern for his reputation. His years of spiritual formation, despite their recent corruption, had established within him a foundation of faith that could not be destroyed by external manipulation. Standing in that chamber surrounded by enemies both human and supernatural, he experienced a moment of clarity that revealed his true calling. "I would rather die as a faithful Christian than live as a servant of darkness," he declared, his voice steady despite the supernatural terror that pressed against him from all sides. "Do what you will with my body, but my soul belongs to Jesus Christ, and neither you nor your master can claim it." The final moments of that October night remained shrouded in mystery, for no reliable witness survived to tell the complete story. What is known comes from evidence discovered decades later and from the testimony of Brother Morrison, who was awakened by sounds of supernatural conflict emanating from beneath the library. Brother Morrison's account, given years later to church investigators, described hearing what sounded like a tremendous spiritual battle being fought in the seminary's depths. Voices raised in prayers and curses, the sound of stone cracking under supernatural pressure, and most disturbing of all, screams that seemed to come from both human and inhuman sources. The conflict lasted for nearly an hour before ending abruptly in a silence that felt more ominous than the preceding chaos. When morning came, Michael Hartwell was gone. His dormitory room showed no signs of struggle, but hidden beneath his mattress was the letter he had written, providing the first clue to the true nature of events at St. Ignatius Seminary. The basement chamber bore evidence of some kind of violent confrontation, with a black altar cracked down the middle and strange burn marks covering the stone walls. Professor Voss claimed that Michael had suffered a complete mental breakdown during an advanced spiritual exercise and had fled the seminary during the night. The official investigation, conducted by diocesan authorities who had been carefully selected for their willingness to accept convenient explanations, concluded that the young seminarian had left voluntarily due to doubts about his vocation, complicated by psychological instability brought on by the rigors of advanced theological study. The other 4 seminarians who had participated in the ceremony were found the next morning in their beds, apparently unconscious but showing no signs of physical injury. When they awakened, they claimed to have no memory of the previous night's events or of their months of study with Professor Voss. Medical examination revealed no obvious cause for their amnesia, and psychiatrists concluded that they had suffered some form of collective psychological trauma that their minds had blocked out as a protective mechanism. Dr. Charles Morrison, a Catholic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the affected seminarians, noted in his confidential report that the young men displayed symptoms consistent with severe spiritual trauma. They exhibit behavior patterns suggesting exposure to experiences that fundamentally challenge their understanding of reality, he wrote. While they claim no memory of traumatic events, their reactions to religious imagery and their resistance to participating in traditional Catholic practices suggest that something profound and disturbing occurred during their time under Professor Voss's instruction. The 4 seminarians were quietly transferred to different institutions for continued evaluation and treatment. Their seminary careers effectively ended. All 4 would struggle with psychological problems for the remainder of their lives, never able to pursue ordination to the priesthood despite their apparent recovery from whatever trauma they had experienced. Professor Heinrich Voss disappeared from St. Ignatius Seminary within 48 hours of Michael's vanishing, claiming to have received urgent summons to return to Rome for consultation with Vatican authorities. His departure was so hasty that he left behind personal possessions and academic materials, suggesting that his exit was neither planned nor voluntary. Subsequent investigation revealed that the Vatican had no record of summoning Professor Voss, and that his claimed credentials from the Pontifical Gregorian University were entirely fabricated. The truth about Professor Voss's identity and origins would not be uncovered for several decades, but when it finally emerged, it revealed connections to occult organizations that had been infiltrating Catholic institutions throughout Europe and America for over a century. His real name was Heinrich Volker, and he was a member of a secretive society that sought to corrupt Catholic seminaries by introducing future priests to practices that would gradually undermine the Church from within. Father Superior Augustine Blackwood's role in the conspiracy became clearer through documents discovered after his death in 1967. His private papers revealed correspondence with individuals claiming to represent Vatican offices, but whose communications contained theological errors that should have alerted any competent Catholic educator to their fraudulent nature. Whether Father Blackwood was deceived by these false authorities or was himself a willing participant in the corruption of St. Ignatius Seminary remains unclear, but his actions certainly facilitated the infiltration that nearly destroyed the institution. In the months following Michael's disappearance and Professor Voss's departure, St. Ignatius Seminary experienced a series of disturbing incidents that suggested the corruption had not been entirely eliminated. Seminarians reported strange dreams involving underground chambers and dark rituals. Several students left the seminary claiming they no longer felt called to the priesthood, unable to explain their sudden change of heart. Most disturbing of all were reports of apparitions seen in the library and corridors, figures in academic robes who seemed to be searching for something or someone. Brother Timothy Morrison, whose long service to the seminary gave him authority to speak frankly with church investigators, reported that the building itself seemed to have been spiritually wounded by whatever had occurred in its depths. The atmosphere changed after that October night, he told investigators. Prayers felt harder to say, as though the air itself resisted holy words. Young men who had shown genuine vocations suddenly became troubled and uncertain. Even the older faculty members seemed nervous and distracted, as though they expected something terrible to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The basement chamber where the final ceremony had been conducted was sealed immediately after the investigation concluded, but seminary maintenance workers reported that strange sounds continued to emanate from behind the locked doors. Some claimed to hear voices speaking in unknown languages, while others described sounds that might have been scratching or digging, as though something were trying to escape from behind the stone walls. The official church response to the events at St. Ignatius was swift and decisive, but focused more on containing potential scandal than on addressing the spiritual implications of what had occurred. A team of investigators from the diocese conducted interviews with faculty and students, but their final report was classified and sealed in church archives. The public was told only that Professor Voss had been recalled to Rome and that Michael Hartwell had left the seminary to discern his vocation in private. Cardinal Francis Brennan, who oversaw the diocesan investigation, privately acknowledged that something extraordinary and disturbing had occurred at St. Ignatius, but his concern was primarily with preventing similar incidents rather than with uncovering the full extent of the corruption that had been exposed. In a confidential memo to Vatican officials, he wrote, "The events at St. Ignatius Seminary represent a systematic attempt to corrupt Catholic priestly formation through the introduction of non-Christian practices disguised as advanced theology. While we have contained the immediate threat, I fear that similar infiltration attempts may be occurring at other institutions. We must develop protocols for identifying and preventing such corruption before it can take root." The investigation into Professor Voss's background revealed the existence of a network of individuals with similar false credentials who had attempted to gain positions at Catholic seminaries throughout the United States during the early 1950s. FBI files, declassified decades later, showed that federal authorities had been monitoring what they termed foreign influence operations, targeting American religious institutions, but the scope of the threat had been vastly underestimated. Agent Robert Sterling, who led the FBI's investigation into the seminary infiltration network, wrote in his final report, "The individuals involved in these operations possess sophisticated knowledge of Catholic theology and institutional structure, suggesting long-term preparation and high-level coordination. Their objective appears to be the gradual corruption of Catholic priestly formation, creating a generation of clergy who would unknowingly serve interests opposed to traditional Christian values. The psychological techniques employed demonstrate familiarity with advanced methods of mind control and spiritual manipulation that exceed anything we have encountered in conventional intelligence operations." The fate of Michael Hartwell remained unknown for over a decade following his disappearance, but in 1965, a discovery in the mountains surrounding St. Ignatius Seminary provided disturbing clues about his final hours. A group of hikers exploring caves in the remote wilderness north of the seminary discovered human remains that were eventually identified through dental records as belonging to the missing seminarian. The condition of the remains suggested that Michael had died from exposure after fleeing into the mountains during that October night in 1953. But the location where his body was found raised questions that the official investigation preferred not to address. The cave lay nearly 20 miles from the seminary, across terrain so treacherous that reaching it would have required superhuman endurance, especially for someone fleeing in darkness during Vermont's harsh autumn weather. More disturbing were the personal effects found with Michael's remains. His rosary, which Brother Morrison remembered him clutching during his final days at the seminary, was discovered wrapped around his skeletal hands in a manner that suggested he had died while praying. But the beads had been transformed into something that no longer resembled a sacred object. Each bead had been carved with symbols that matched those found in the basement chamber, as though his desperate prayers had somehow burned the markings of his spiritual battle into the blessed objects. Also found with the remains was a leather journal that Michael had apparently carried during his flight from the seminary. The entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as physical exhaustion and spiritual trauma took their toll, provided the most complete account of the final ceremony and its aftermath that investigators would ever possess. The journal's final entries revealed that Michael's escape from the basement chamber had been aided by supernatural intervention that he attributed to divine protection granted through his refusal to participate in the dark ceremony. "The walls themselves seemed to crack and crumble when I called upon the name of Jesus," he wrote. Professor Voss and his corrupted seminarians were thrown back by some invisible force, and I found myself able to flee through passages that I had never seen before, as though the very stones of the seminary were helping me escape from the evil that had infected them. But Michael's escape came at a terrible cost that revealed the true nature of the spiritual forces he had opposed. The journal described how he was pursued through the mountains by entities that were not entirely human, beings that could track him across distances and through terrain where no ordinary pursuit could have succeeded. His descriptions of these pursuers matched accounts found in medieval texts describing demonic manifestations, creatures that served as enforcers for those who had violated spiritual covenants. "They follow me still," Michael wrote in one of his final entries. "Not with physical bodies that grow tired or lose the trail, but with a spiritual presence that grows stronger as my own strength fails. I understand now that my refusal to complete the ceremony has marked me for destruction by forces that will not rest until they have claimed what they believe was promised to them. I pray that my sacrifice will serve as warning to others who might be tempted by the false promises of power that these infiltrators offer to the faithful." The journal's last entry, barely legible and apparently written during Michael's final hours, contained a warning that would prove prophetic. "The corruption spreads beyond St. Ignatius." Professor Voss spoke of similar operations at seminaries throughout the country. "They seek to create an army of corrupted priests who will serve their dark master while believing they serve Christ. The church must be warned, but I fear my voice will never be heard. May God grant that others will have the courage to resist what I could only flee from. Pray for my soul and for the souls of those who will face these temptations in years to come." Michael's journal was turned over to church authorities and immediately classified, its contents deemed too dangerous for general circulation. Cardinal Brennan ordered that copies be sent to the Vatican with recommendations for a comprehensive investigation of Catholic seminaries throughout the United States. But the response from Rome was disappointing to those who hoped for decisive action against the infiltration network. Vatican officials acknowledged the seriousness of the threat but concluded that public revelation of the seminary corruption would cause more harm than good to the Church's mission and reputation. Instead, they implemented a series of classified protocols for identifying and removing suspected infiltrators, while ensuring that knowledge of the threat remained strictly limited to the highest levels of church hierarchy. The decision to suppress the truth about St. Ignatius Seminary would have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate participants in the events of 1953. Over the following decades, similar incidents would occur at Catholic institutions throughout the United States, but the pattern would not be recognized because each case was handled in isolation and the relevant information was never shared between dioceses. Father James McKenna, who served as a Vatican investigator specializing in cases of suspected occult infiltration, later wrote in his private memoirs, "The decision to classify the St. Ignatius case established a precedent that would plague the Church for generations. By treating each incident as an isolated threat rather than recognizing the systematic nature of the assault on Catholic institutions, we allowed the corruption to spread unchecked. The fear of scandal prevented us from taking the decisive action that might have prevented countless future victims." The 4 seminarians who had participated in Professor Voss's ceremonies but survived the final night faced challenges that would persist for the rest of their lives. Despite their claimed amnesia about the events, they exhibited behavioral changes that suggested profound psychological and spiritual trauma. All 4 eventually left their respective treatment facilities, but none was ever able to pursue ordination to the priesthood. Robert Chin, the seminarian from San Francisco, became a successful businessman but was plagued throughout his life by recurring nightmares that he could never quite remember upon waking. His family reported that he would often wake screaming in languages that no one could identify, and that he showed an inexplicable aversion to churches and religious ceremonies. He died in 1987 at the age of 54, apparently from natural causes, but friends noted that his final illness began on October 20th, the anniversary of the ceremony at St. Ignatius. David Kowalski returned to Chicago where he attempted to resume a normal life, but his family noticed disturbing changes in his personality and behavior. The young man who had entered the seminary filled with faith and enthusiasm for serving God became withdrawn and fearful, jumping at unexpected sounds and showing signs of paranoia that gradually worsened over time. He was hospitalized multiple times for what psychiatrists diagnosed as severe anxiety disorder, but his condition never improved significantly. He disappeared in 1971 while walking alone in Chicago's Lincoln Park, and his body was never found. James Murphy, who had been considered one of the most promising seminarians in his class before the events at St. Ignatius, suffered what appeared to be a complete personality change following his treatment for amnesia. His parents reported that their son seemed like a stranger, polite and functional but lacking any spark of the warmth and spiritual enthusiasm that had characterized him throughout his youth. He worked various jobs over the years but never married or formed close relationships, living as though he were merely going through the motions of existence. He died by suicide in 1976, leaving a note that read simply, "I cannot remember what was done to me, but I cannot forget that something was taken that can never be restored." Thomas Anderson's fate was perhaps the most disturbing of all the survivors. After his release from psychiatric treatment, he returned to Minneapolis and attempted to rebuild his life, but his family noticed that he seemed to be fighting an internal battle that grew more intense over time. He would be found kneeling in prayer at all hours of the day and night, begging forgiveness for sins he claimed he could not remember but knew he had committed. In 1969, he entered a Trappist monastery, hoping that a life of rigorous penance and contemplation would bring peace to his tormented soul. He died in 1980 after 16 years of monastic life, but his fellow monks reported that he never seemed to find the spiritual peace he sought. The pattern of early deaths and psychological torment among the St. Ignatius survivors did not go unnoticed by church officials who had been briefed on the case. Dr. Morrison, the Catholic psychiatrist who had evaluated the seminarians, continued to monitor their progress over the years and was struck by the consistency of their symptoms and the tragic outcomes they all experienced. In a report submitted to church authorities in 1981, Dr. Morrison wrote, "The 4 seminarians who survived the events at St. Ignatius Seminary all exhibited signs of what I can only describe as spiritual trauma that transcended anything I have encountered in conventional psychiatric practice." Despite their claimed inability to remember the specific events that occurred during Professor Voss's final ceremony, their behavior suggests that their souls were wounded in ways that no earthly therapy could heal. The consistency of their symptoms and the timing of their deaths suggest that they remained bound to whatever dark forces they encountered during their time at the seminary. The long-term impact of the St. Ignatius incident extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect the entire Catholic educational system in ways that would not be fully understood for decades. The protocols established for identifying and preventing similar infiltration attempts led to increased surveillance and control over seminary curricula and faculty appointments, but also created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that stifled legitimate theological development. Young priests who graduated from seminaries in the years following the St. Ignatius incident reported feeling unprepared for the spiritual challenges they encountered in pastoral work. The emphasis on preventing corruption had led to an overcautious approach to theological education that avoided any topics that might be considered controversial or dangerous, even when such knowledge was essential for effective ministry. Father William Connolly, who served as rector of several East Coast seminaries during the 1960s and 1970s, observed in his retirement memoirs, "The fear of another St. Ignatius situation created a generation of priests who were theologically timid and spiritually unprepared for the real battles they would face in parish work. We protected them from exposure to dangerous ideas, but in doing so, we also deprived them of the tools they needed to recognize and combat genuine spiritual threats when they encountered them in their ministries." The irony was that the Church's response to the seminary infiltration may have made Catholic institutions more vulnerable to future attacks rather than less. By treating the St. Ignatius case as an isolated incident and suppressing information about the broader infiltration network, church authorities missed opportunities to identify and counter similar operations at other institutions. FBI files, declassified in the 1990s, revealed that the network associated with Heinrich Voss/Volker had successfully placed operatives in at least 12 other seminaries during the 1950s and 1960s. The operations were generally more subtle than the blatant corruption attempted at St. Ignatius, focusing on gradual influence rather than dramatic conversion ceremonies. But the cumulative effect was significant, creating a cohort of priests whose formation had been subtly influenced by anti-Christian ideology disguised as progressive theology. Agent Sterling's final report on the infiltration network, completed in 1968, concluded, "The operation targeting American Catholic seminaries represents one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns we have documented. The perpetrators demonstrated detailed knowledge of Catholic theology, institutional structure, and the psychological profiles of young men entering priestly formation. Their success in avoiding detection for extended periods suggests professional training in intelligence techniques and access to resources that exceed what we would expect from a purely religious organization." The report recommended continued monitoring of Catholic educational institutions and closer cooperation between church authorities and federal agencies in identifying potential threats. But the recommendations were largely ignored due to constitutional concerns about government surveillance of religious institutions and the Church's own preference for handling such matters internally. The truth about Professor Heinrich Voss's ultimate fate remained unknown until 1989, when German reunification led to the opening of East German intelligence archives. Documents discovered in Stasi files revealed that Heinrich Volker was indeed the real name of the man who had infiltrated St. Ignatius Seminary, and that he was part of a larger operation coordinated by Soviet intelligence services to undermine Western religious institutions. The Stasi records showed that Volker had been recruited in the 1930s as a young theology student and had spent over 20 years being prepared for deep cover operations in Catholic institutions. His false credentials from the Pontifical Gregorian University had been created by a team of specialists who had studied Vatican procedures and documentation for years, producing forgeries so sophisticated that they passed examination by church authorities who had no reason to suspect deception. According to the declassified files, Volker's mission at St. Ignatius was part of a broader campaign called Operation Shepherd, designed to create a network of compromised priests who could be activated to serve Soviet interests during critical periods of the Cold War. The supernatural elements of his activities were apparently genuine rather than mere psychological manipulation, suggesting that the Communist intelligence services had recruited individuals with actual occult abilities for use in operations targeting religious institutions. The Stasi files indicated that Volker successfully escaped from Vermont in 1953 and was exfiltrated to East Germany, where he continued to work on similar operations targeting Catholic institutions in Western Europe. He died in 1987 in East Berlin, taking with him secrets about the full extent of the infiltration network and the methods used to corrupt Catholic priestly formation. The revelation of Soviet involvement in the St. Ignatius case prompted a major reassessment of Cold War intelligence operations and led to increased cooperation between the Vatican and Western intelligence agencies. But by the time the truth emerged, most of the immediate participants in the events were dead, and the opportunity to fully understand and counter the infiltration network had been lost. Modern St. Ignatius Seminary, rebuilt and relocated to a different site in Vermont, operates under strict protocols designed to prevent any repetition of the 1953 incident. The original building was eventually demolished in 1975, officially due to structural problems but actually because of the persistent reports of supernatural activity that made it unsuitable for continued use as a religious institution. Before the demolition, a final investigation of the sealed basement chamber was conducted by a team of church officials and academic experts. Their report, which remains classified in Vatican archives, allegedly documented physical evidence of supernatural phenomena that defied scientific explanation. The chamber walls bore symbols that appeared to have been burned into the stone by intense heat, but showed no signs of fire damage. More disturbing were markings that seemed to record the names and spiritual conditions of individuals who had participated in ceremonies conducted in the space. Father Michael O'Brien, who participated in the final investigation, was quoted in leaked portions of the report as saying, "The chamber itself seemed to resist our presence, as though the very stones had been infected by whatever evil was practiced there. The temperature dropped significantly as we descended, and several team members reported feeling watched by invisible presences. Most disturbing were the sounds that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, voices speaking in languages that our linguistic experts could not identify but which conveyed unmistakable malevolence." The demolition of the original St. Ignatius building was conducted with unusual precautions that suggested church authorities feared that simply destroying the structure might not be sufficient to eliminate whatever spiritual contamination it contained. The basement chambers were filled with concrete mixed with blessed salt and holy water, and the entire site was subjected to extensive exorcism rituals before demolition began. Even after the building's destruction, the site continued to be associated with unusual phenomena that troubled local residents and visiting pilgrims. Hikers in the area reported encounters with robed figures who seemed to be searching for something among the ruins. Electronic equipment malfunctioned near the former seminary location, and several people claimed to have photographed apparitions among the scattered stones. The Catholic Church's official position on the St. Ignatius incident remains unchanged. A single infiltrator successfully deceived seminary authorities and attempted to corrupt priestly formation before being discovered and removed. The disappearance of Michael Hartwell is acknowledged as a tragedy resulting from the psychological trauma caused by exposure to heretical teachings, but his role in preventing greater corruption is not officially recognized. However, unofficial sources within the Church suggest that Michael Hartwell is being considered for beatification as a martyr for the faith. The process would require extensive investigation of his life and death, including examination of the evidence suggesting that his refusal to participate in the dark ceremony prevented the corruption of 4 other seminarians and potentially saved St. Ignatius Seminary from complete spiritual destruction. The cause for Michael's beatification faces significant obstacles, primarily the Church's reluctance to publicly acknowledge the full extent of the supernatural elements involved in the St. Ignatius case. Recognizing Michael as a martyr would require admitting that the threat he faced was real and significant, potentially opening discussions about similar cases that the Church prefers to keep classified. Father Thomas Brennan, who has served as postulator for Michael's cause since 1995, believes that the young seminarian's sacrifice deserves recognition regardless of the political complications it might create. Michael Hartwell faced a test of faith that few Christians have ever encountered, Father Brennan argues. He chose to suffer and die rather than betray his Lord, even when the betrayal was disguised as advanced theological study. His courage prevented evil from achieving a victory that could have corrupted Catholic priestly formation for generations. The debate over Michael's beatification reflects broader questions about how the Catholic Church should address the reality of supernatural evil in the modern world. Progressive theologians argue that focusing on dramatic cases like St. Ignatius distracts from more mundane but equally important moral challenges facing contemporary Christianity. Conservative theologians counter that the Church's reluctance to acknowledge supernatural threats leaves Catholics unprepared for genuine spiritual warfare. As we conclude this investigation into the dark secrets of St. Ignatius Seminary, we're left with disturbing questions about how many similar incidents may have occurred at religious institutions throughout the United States during the Cold War era. The sophisticated nature of the infiltration operation suggests that it was part of a larger campaign that may have succeeded in ways we still don't fully understand. The fate of Michael Hartwell reminds us that true heroism sometimes requires making sacrifices that the world will never acknowledge or understand. His decision to resist corruption, even at the cost of his life, prevented evil from achieving a victory that could have had far-reaching consequences for American Catholicism and perhaps for Christianity itself. The spiritual battle that took place in the basement chambers of St. Ignatius Seminary in 1953 was fought in darkness and secrecy, witnessed only by participants who took their secrets to their graves. But the outcome of that battle may have shaped the religious landscape of America in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. What do you think happened during those final moments in the basement chamber? Do you believe Michael Hartwell's sacrifice prevented a greater evil from corrupting Catholic priestly formation? Have you ever encountered unexplained phenomena in religious buildings that left you wondering what spiritual battles might have been fought there in the past? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden mysteries. The darkness that threatened St. Ignatius Seminary may have been defeated, but similar battles between good and evil continue to be fought in places and ways that most people never suspect. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those whose names are never known, whose sacrifices are never acknowledged, but whose courage in the face of ultimate evil changes the course of history in ways that only eternity will fully reveal. Michael Hartwell may have died alone in a mountain cave, but his final act of faith echoes through the decades as a reminder that some things are worth dying for, and that the battle between light and darkness never truly ends. See you in the next investigation, where we'll explore another chapter from America's hidden supernatural history.